I'm Micah Walter. I'm the webmaster at the Cooper-Hewitt. And I got this fortune cookie about a year ago. And so, you know, I've been thinking about coming to talk to all of you for quite a while, because, you know, over the last year or so, and since I've been working at the Cooper-Hewitt, I've been thinking a lot about collections and museums and things like that. And it's funny because I, you know, came to museums in a really sort of bizarre way. I sort of fell into museums. And when I started working at the Cooper-Hewitt, I really didn't know anything about collection management systems or why people collect stuff in the first place. And it was supposed to be sort of a 6-week gig, and it turned into a kind of career. So I thought I'd share with you a little story here. The last time I was home, I was hanging out with my mom, and I noticed something really interesting about her, which was that she's a really great collector. She collects birds, the one in this picture, and you know, all kinds of other things like snow globes, refrigerator magnets, whatever. She collects things on a whim sometimes. Yeah. So I always think of her as sort of like a real-life Pinterest board. You know, she just kind of picks and chooses what she wants and organizes it however she likes. And I kind of thought this is sort of really interesting because, you know, everyone collects stuff. That's just part of what we do. It's a natural thing to do. People just, for whatever reason, I haven't really been able to put my finger on it yet, we like to collect things. Working at the museum, I started to think about, you know, how this relates to museums and the Smithsonian collecting things, and why we collect, you know, all kinds of stuff at the Smithsonian. I still don't really know why. And I started looking at our collection database and trying to figure out, you know, what it is we had in our collection and kind of where that came from. And it was really difficult. So in the beginning, when I first started at Cooper-Hewitt, we had something called eMuseum, which I didn't really know what it was yet. And in eMuseum, we had about 1,000 objects on public display. So you could go onto the website and you could search through about 1,000 objects. But that was only 1,000 of the 225,000 objects we had in our collection. So it's a really small amount. And I always was sort of curious as to why, you know, that was such a small amount. Why didn't we put the whole thing out there for everyone to see? And so eventually I figured out that eMuseum was this thing that was connected to this other thing called TMS, which some of you may have heard of. And I realized that TMS was where all the stuff was. We had 225,000 object records in TMS. So I started poking around in TMS, and I realized I still didn't really understand what our collection was all about. I couldn't see it. I couldn't visualize or, you know, get a feeling for what we collected. And I was also still really just kind of curious why there was only 1,000 records online. About, I guess, back in, about a year ago now, back in November, Seb Chan came to us and became my boss and created my department, which I didn't really have a department before that. And on our first day and many days after that, but I remember specifically on his first day, we went out for coffee and he sat down and said, you know, he said to me, what is it you want to do differently here? What do you want to change? What do you want to accomplish? And, you know, I talked about some things that were on my mind at the time, like upgrading the Drupal 7, making a responsive, mobile-friendly website for us, lots of little Webmaster kinds of things you think about. But the one thing we kept coming back to was the collection. Why was there only 1,000 objects online on the collection? And, you know, we're a design museum, so it's this thing where we need to get our collection online. We need people to be able to see it and touch it and feel it in a virtual way. And so we talked about, you know, how could we actually accomplish this with what we've already got happening here? So we talked about eMuseum and what it could do. And we talked about, what would happen if we put everything out there right now, today. And we quickly realized that even if we did that, if we put all 250,000 objects publicly up on the e-museum website, you still really couldn't understand what the collection was all about. You could browse it and you could look at things, but you couldn't really figure out what it was as a whole. So we wanted to change that. And we started to think of some strategies about how to change that. The first one was to start a blog. And so we started the Cooper-Hewitt Labs blog. And it was fairly, stripped down and basic. It wasn't anything fancy. We actually didn't even really link to it on our main website or anything like that. We just sort of launched it. And the idea of the Labs blog was to create sort of a scratch pad or a notebook, some place to write down what it was we were working on and what it was we wanted to be working on. And to get feedback from the community of all you people. The most important thing about the Labs blog was that we felt like it was a useful tool to create momentum. And what I mean by that is sort of the momentum of having things shift, changing people's minds about things, and kind of pushing forward with the kinds of things we wanted to do, sort of politically and technically. Right before we launched the Labs blog, this is kind of what our e-museum website looked like. And between our curators and registrars and some of our other higher-ups, we were able to take that 1,000 records and up it to 10,000 records. This is done through a whole bunch of, what should be on the website kind of discussions. And kind of trying to figure out sort of what's worthy of being on our website. What should we put up there? It still wasn't really good enough for me. That was a tenfold change, but it still wasn't 225,000 records. And so we started to think about, all right, well, now that we have this, and this is the minimum criteria we have at the moment, a photograph, a little bit of metadata, and a title, that kind of thing. We started to think about, well, what if we tried to reduce the minimum criteria for what goes on the website? What if it looked like this? So it doesn't have a photo, it doesn't even have a name, really. It's just, this one's just called bound print. And so we reduced the minimum criteria to basically be that it had a title, well, not a title, but a sort of a name, and a credit line, a verified credit line. And when we did that, it took our number of 10,000 records and pushed it up to a little over 125,000 records. So again, another change of magnitude or tenfold change. This was really exciting because now we had, more than half of our collection online. Even though the metadata and what you see when you go to it is pretty minimal, at least we have it there and it's available to talk about and think about. But it still wasn't really enough, and we thought, well, the next step really is to actually give this metadata away. And what I mean by that is, put it up for download. That was sort of our first idea, as a CSV file or something like that, and license it as Creative Commons 0, so public domain. This was a pretty big deal at the Smithsonian. We've never done that before. And it took a lot of talking and kind of fleshing out the idea of what that would mean after we did it. And, we were getting to the point where it's like, okay, let's go for it, let's do it. And Seb and I were thinking about, well, what happens after that? If we put our metadata online as a downloadable CSV file, that could be kind of the end of what happens here. And remember, we're trying to build this momentum and keep on moving forward. So we came up with the idea of putting it onto GitHub. And if you don't know what GitHub is, it's a website designed for computer programmers to share and store their source code. It wasn't really designed for large amounts of data, but it sort of has the same kind of tools that we might like to use. You can do things on GitHub like fork your data, which means we can put up on Cooper-Hewitt's account our data, and anyone can kind of take a clone of that or a fork of that into their own account and kind of do with it what they please. But still, our data, our authoritative data, sits on our own account, kind of untouched by that. And it gives us the opportunity to think about how to kind of bring in changes from other people's massaging of our data or cleaning it up and that kind of thing. Because one of the things we really noticed was that our data was pretty bad. You know, it was pretty messy and ugly and difficult to figure out why. And we thought, you know, we really just don't have the resources and the ability to actually clean it up ourselves. So we didn't want to just put it up there on as a downloadable file for people to have. We wanted people to actually do things with it. So we did that. We put it up on GitHub. And a lot of people looked at it. A lot of people forked it, downloaded it, and made comments and made changes and things like that. But again, this is sort of an experiment. We didn't really know how to deal with a lot of different things once we'd done that. One of them was the images. You know, we weren't able to license our images as CC0 for a lot of different reasons. But we had images, and we felt it was really important for people to have access to the images. So in the GitHub repository, we mention the URLs to these images, but that they're not CC0. So, you know, we're still trying to figure out how to deal with images and making them available. Other people took our data and did fun things with it like this. And all of a sudden, you can start to see what the collection kind of looks like. For example, we have 4,274 match saves. Before we put the collection up, we didn't really know that. I mean, we knew we had a lot of match saves. But, you know, we didn't realize the comparison to all the other things and how it related and how it kind of influenced what we collected and why. So now, you know, we're able to kind of massage the data a bit and play with it, and other people can do things like put it into Google Refine and, you know, help us sort of fix the data. And we can look at it in different ways, but that's sort of, you know, not enough for us. We wanted to kind of move forward. And we realized that now that we have this data up and available in public, we need to kind of build something that would allow us to look at the collection in a whole new way. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Aaron.
Hello. That's the URL of the new collections website. It's the old URL as well, in case no one's ever seen it. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron. I am recently arrived at the Cooper-Hewitt as of July. Before that, I spent a couple years at Stamen Design in San Francisco, mostly making maps. And before that, I worked for about 1,000 years at Flickr, involved in all the geo and machine tag stuff. Tangentially, I am also a member of the Spinny Bar Historical Society. I mention that because we have new stickers this year. Come and see me afterwards if you'd like one. I'm part of the nerd crew at the Cooper-Hewitt, and my job is to help imagine and then figure out how we actually build the tools and the systems necessary to make the museum well and truly part of the internet. For those of you who don't know, we're closed until 2014. We're doing renovations. And we have the opportunity to reimagine pretty much every aspect of the museum, from the collection itself all the way up to the building. And so when I say we want to be part of the internet, we do. We really want to figure out what it means, not just to lay like another microsite on top of the internet, but to be participants. We're doing this both as a practical necessity and as a public good. We are trying to move away from a singular narrative motive to a place where the collection can speak not only to experts and scholars, but to casual visitors, and increasingly, and this is sort of weird hand-wavy squishy talk, but it's going to happen, increasingly to the network itself. Here's the too long, didn't read version of this talk. TMS will remain the source of truth for the foreseeable future. eMuseum, we threw under the bus. We are writing our own tools in-house from scratch. We are building interfaces and indexes that are tailored to our needs and not a kind of abstract pony soup factory of so many packaged solutions. This isn't calling out TMS. I mean, it exists sort of, it's a widespread problem. We are not building a platform, which I realize is tantamount to heresy in some museum circles. I can live with that. To the extent possible, we will open source our work where it's relevant. We are available to answer questions. We will share what we know. But we're not writing a magic pony. We are trying to write something for ourselves. This is a crazy, crazy time, and we need that flexibility. And the reason I say this is because every collection is a special flower. That's not a pejorative. That's what makes our collections valuable. And then there's the fact that when you look under the hood of a collections management system, as I've had the pleasure of doing for the last few months, you realize that as much as anything, they're tools for encoding and enforcing relationship management. They are the place where the rules around objects and donors and what can be said and what can be shown and when are stored. And to try and build like a battleship-sized catch-all to encode that kind of data, to encode those kinds of rules, it's just, frankly, it's just insane. Like, we have better things to do right now. There's a lot of layers to this problem. I mentioned that we're not getting rid of TMS anytime soon. People have lots of complaints about it. You hear it in public, rarely, mostly in private. And I want to stress something, which is that there's at least, I said there's many layers. There's at least two of them. One of them is the data modeling, which is one thing. The larger problem is that TMS is a question of social practices inside the institution. It's a user interface problem. It's a usability problem. It's an interaction problem. And we would be well served if somebody chose to tackle that. But it's not going to be us right now. We have another mandate, and the mandate is the collection. And at best, we know that our problems are a series of known unknowns. So simply put, we need to move faster than eMuseum will move for us, whether it's pricing, whether it's release schedules, any of it. So where do you start? You start with the data. Again, I want to come back to TMS, and I want to stress something, which is that working code always wins. Whatever complaints people have, we have gotten this far on TMS, and we have lots of good stuff to show for it. It can't be all bad. In quiet moments, when I look at it, what I see is a system that was designed from a time before big, cheap disks, from a time before cheap RAM. If I had been architecting it when TMS first started, I probably would have made a lot of the same architectural decisions. Here's the problem, though. Once data goes into TMS, no one has any idea what happens to it. I have never met anyone who can say with confidence that they know where the data goes or how to get it back out. That's really bad, right? To listen to people talk about their collections in terms of the shadows that the data in the database cast is really dangerous in the long term. Like, we're not doing ourselves any favors, excuse me. If there's anyone here from TMS, please come and find me afterwards and tell me I'm wrong. I think, honestly, one of the things TMS has done is they've indulged their clients, namely us, in this ridiculous notion that there is a single cross-platform, a cross-institutional platform for this stuff. I mean, you get a user interface that pretends to do that, and under the hood, the kind of, like, the complexity of the hoop jumping required to make that possible inside the confines of a relational database means that essentially TMS is nothing but an infinite series of pointers to simply define a field name. Values are an order of magnitude longer. Fine. You would think that the easiest thing to do would be to just dump everything out as CSV files and work backwards from there. Buckets. The good news is you can. The bad news is it's not obvious on any level. Trying to get data out of TMS is some toxic stew of Windows networking hell. ODBC, wow, that must have seemed like a good idea at the time. The vagaries of the ANSI SQL 92 spec, and the spectacle of its implementation or instrumentation in MS SQL. Also, Unicode, right? Good times. The short version is just use Perl. If you're not a Perl hacker, just hold your nose. It's got the best database libraries out there. It knows how to deal with most of the minutia. And it's been battle tested for years. And it will save you from random things, including Python's PyODBC library, which on 64-bit OS X machines will silently convert all the data coming back from the database to UTF-16, because Windows? I don't know. So far, the biggest problem we've had is the length of text fields. Specifically, some part of this whole relationship chain causes the database to return a length of -1 for certain text fields. So the practical solution to this is swearing in your source code. 5 minutes. I'm totally not going to get through all this. I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to put the full text of this up online shortly. Getting stuff out of the database. Wow. Seriously, binary timestamps. This is not a TMS thing. This is MS SQL. What were they thinking? CSV parsers can't deal with binary timestamps. Just drop them on the floor. Also, apparently external is a reserved keyword. So don't put that in your tables. Right? This is really bad. That this is what you have to do to get something out of your database. It paralyzes people. Like I've talked to people for the last 5 or 6 years, and they're just like, we don't know what to do. We can't figure out how to make it do new tricks. Little baby walruses. I'm going to blow through the next couple slides. This is stuff that will be online. This is some of the technical bits. We're using an anti-framework called Flamework, which is being written by ex-Flickr people. It's just a series of tools. It's shared libraries and code conventions. It's built on Apache, which everyone hates because Apache's quite big. On the other hand, if you're going to write a web application, seriously, just do yourself a favor. They've been at this for 15 years. They're better at it than anyone else. Mod rewrite. Web applications pretty much mean two things. One is pretty URLs and dispatching. Mod rewrite is terrifying, not because there's anything particular about mod rewrite, but because it implements the pattern of if this, then that. Just think about what that means. If you can have a declarative format for doing if this, then that statements, sure, you can make your life crazy, crazy complicated. I would rather something like mod rewrite than somebody's sort of half-baked implementation of it in the programming language of their choice. That's me. I'm not here to sell you on anything. It's just what we chose to do. PHP is as bad as everyone says, except for the part where it's blazingly fast. Some fairly successful companies like Facebook and Flickr and Yahoo and Etsy, who made $500 million before the year was out, are all using PHP. Part of the reason I think people hate PHP and Apache is because the dream was for Apache to have lots of programming languages. The only one that works is PHP. It's too bad. MySQL, it's fast, it scales. Honestly, we don't have any problem with scaling. We don't have the traffic, we don't have the volume. We aspire to it. We aspire to have this problem. write your own SQL. Object relational models are crazy. Why would you ever do this? They will bite you in the ass. Solar, almost certainly in the future. We may, in fact, move most of the data store over to it. Right now, it's just the time to do indexes and to refeed the data is prohibitive. We need to move faster than that right now. Elasticsearch is awesome. It lets you index heterogeneous documents without schemas. That's really good, right? It's actually super interesting to think about that if you've got a bag full of CSV files from something like TMS. It's a really interesting way to go spelunking. On the other hand, the only way to do complex queries in Elasticsearch is with a bespoke JSON syntax. This is like the dumbest idea I've seen in the last 20 years. It means that your ability to query your data is tied to your programming language's JSON serializer. It's really, really bad. Come find me in the bar, I'll give you all the gory details. This is the most important part. This is what we care about right now. It is the speed with which the code running the application can be rearranged in order to adapt to circumstances. That's the world we live in right now. It's not just the collection, remember. We're tying this to the building. We're tying this to everything we do. So I started work on July 2nd. On September 27th, we took the old eMuseum website down and replaced it with this website. It's very much an alpha. It is meant to be a living, breathing example of the direction that we're heading. Aside from all the stuff like stable identifiers and making everything almost a first-class object on the web, one of the simpler things we've done is to add a random button to make explicit a kind of random access memory to our collection. We scoped the random button to only those objects that have photos. This is really important because not everyone lives and breathes the collection the way we do. They don't have time to look at stuff like this. This is real. We have things in our collection where we don't know who did it. We might know when it was made. We know it's print. We don't know what it's of. We don't have a picture of it. And we're not sure where it is. So basically, we have a piece of paper somewhere. I'm totally out of time, but I'm gonna blow over a little bit. I promise I'll keep going as fast. We totally haven't blown over time. That's fine. Again, this is our history. And we've proven that despite all of this, despite these shortcomings, we know how to get stuff done. Right? This is not a reflection of everything we are. It just means our data's kind of weird. We have stuff like this. This is what is it? It's a poster we don't have a picture for. And this is the description, and it's kind of lovely, right? Like 2 boys and 2 girls holding a blanket into which a 3rd boy in a tree shakes down chestnuts. Hillside in background with another group of children to the right gathering chestnuts. You would be forgiven for thinking that the Cooper-Hewitt has started collecting Markov bots. We know our data is weird. We know our data is incomplete. We will fix it. This is like the world's most famous chair ever. So the point is that we're still feeling the shape of what's in there. Right? This is the world that we live in now. The data it's been locked away for so long, both in the database and in institutional histories, that we're going to have to spend some serious time digging it out. One of the ways we've been trying to do this is by holding hands with other institutions and other data sources. We're actively trying to build concordances between our projects, our data, and other projects like Wikipedia, Freebase, other cultural institutions like MoMA. We started with the people in our collection. That was the easiest thing to do. Trying to build concordances across objects is we should do it, but it's a big problem. We'd like to do this for everything, but so far we started with people. We're only doing it for about 5 sources because they were the ones that were the easiest to start with. For example, we don't actually have a biography for Ray Eames. Now, that's one of those instances where, like, if we needed to have a biography that we wrote ourselves for anybody, it might be her. But that's just not true of every person in our database. There's about 4,000 or 5,000 of them that are public. we don't all need, as cultural heritage institutions, to be writing the same biography for Bob Dylan over and over and over again. And let's be honest, the Wikipedia community is doing, in many cases, a better job of this. So yeah, we're totally going to build on what they're doing. We're going to celebrate it. It's great. It's better than what we had yesterday. We're not pulling in any data from MoMA the way we are from Wikipedia, but because we're able to map people IDs, we can, in the charming words of Seb Chan, connect ours to theirs. Australians get away with saying the craziest stuff. But like, this is the whole point of the internet. And we started publishing these concordances. We did a public dump a couple weeks ago, and for reasons that I don't understand, I only included those people for which we had at least one concordance. Oops. Earlier this week, we got around to publishing an updated version of the collections metadata that Micah was talking about. It looks very different than the first version, but there are now individual JSON blobs for every first-class object in the collection. Roles, exhibitions, people, objects, temporal periods. And we're standing all of these things up to make them present and addressable on the internet so that we can make a larger surface area for collecting things. That's where I'm really almost done. And we're also in the process of Nightlight launching a public API. It's hiding in plain sight, but it's not ready for general use because we need to be able to change stuff really quickly. The reason I mention it is both the metadata dumps and the API responses use the same code base. The response you get in one is what you'll see in the other. If no one here has read Luke Dernley's talk from Museums in the Web in 2010 about the disconnect that the Powerhouse Museum had between their public dumps and their APIs, I would encourage you. I'll put a link up later. So that's where we're at, 4 months in. There is a lot left to do. But this is the work. It's 2012. These are the hard problems. It's a good time to be here. And if there's not anyone here who isn't already aware of the work that the Government Digital Services team in the UK is doing around gov.uk, just go there now and read it. They're doing the best work on the internet right now. Both the ambition and the execution of the work that they're doing is inspiring. It's amazing. Thank you. And I'm sorry I went over 2 minutes and 36 seconds.
No worries. So thank you, Micah and Aaron, for that. Obviously, lots to talk about there, but in the interest of keeping on track for our next presenter's slot, let's move right on to Adrian Kingston. We seem perhaps not to have our third speaker here with us, so presuming he does not show up momentarily, we should have some good time for discussion after Adrian has his bit. Oh, okay. Thank you for that. So we will definitely have some time for open discussion touching on points raised by both presentations after Adrian has his say here. So Adrian Kingston from Te Papa Tongarewa. And I hope I didn't make that.
Okay. So that's good because my presentation is too long as well. And the good thing is, we're told as New Zealanders we talk too fast, and I was about to talk even faster to try and get through it, but it looks like I can ease off a tiny bit. I hope you enjoyed the previous presentation because mine is the complete opposite. And I could rename it How to Build a Battleship because that's what I'm talking about here essentially. Okay, is that actually just going to the camera or? Yeah. Okay, I will speak up. Okay, so I'm Adrian Kingston. I'm from the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa. We're the National Museum and the National Art Gallery in New Zealand. And I'm essentially going to be talking about the theory of how far you can push a collection management system in a changing world. And this is the disclaimer for the whole presentation. I was really pleased this morning when Christina said that not everything we do is super glamorous because this presentation isn't and what I'm talking about isn't, but it is a fundamental discussion. There's no pretty pictures, so again, it's good that you've had your fill. But at the same time, there's no screenshots, which is fantastic. A lot of what I'm going to talk about may seem obvious, old-fashioned, or even slightly backwards, and probably overly optimistic. And others have a very different approach, and that's cool. And I've got no problem with people coming up to me afterwards and telling me that we're completely wrong and we're doing something stupid. But this is the path that we're sort of looking at. And a lot of people are talking about it, and there's a few links here, particularly on the Museum Computer Group mail list a little while ago. There was this discussion about it, and Nick Poole is very much driving down this path as well. I'm not going to talk about the actual system that we use, because it's not about an individual system, it's about systems in general. And I'm also very much focusing on the collection management layer, not on the web layers or the access layers, although, as Aaron was just saying, they're getting closer and closer tied together anyway. We're a collections information team. There's 4 of us. We have backgrounds in collections. We aren't curators, but we do know the collections and the processes really well. We aren't programmers, and that will become really obvious. But we do understand web, and we do understand technology in general. So we see ourselves as translators and enablers, working between curatorial staff, collection staff, conservators, as well as programmers and audience engagement and the audience themselves. We do take a longer term view and a wider scope. We're not quite so project focused. And for those of you who don't know, Te Papa is the National Museum of National Art Gallery, as I said. We're not huge by international standards, but we're big enough. But we're incredibly diverse. We have the National Art Collection. We also have history, science, botany and zoology. And our processes range from DNA analysis through to repatriation of human remains. So that complexity, possibly our isolation, will have an impact on our chosen path. So a central repository for all collection-related information and assets. This is our experience. Not saying it's right, this is our experience. 5 years ago, we needed a new system. We needed it to manage our physical collections, the same as everybody else does. The diversity of our collections made it a little bit more complicated, but we centralised completely the description of our collections. We tried to make sure that there was as much commonality across the collections as possible, whilst keeping in mind the specific requirements for each collection type. Obviously, there's big distinction between humanities and science, but we still look to have as much overlap as possible so that they were interoperable. It looks like that. That's not overly complicated, and most people's collection management systems should do that to a degree. It also manages the processes, the usual processes that we're all used to: acquisition, deaccession, lending and borrowing, all of those sorts of things. But it manages it as a process, not as a final decision. So that means it actually records arguments, and I actually think that's really important for understanding why our collection is in the shape that it is. And this is, of course, for the long term. So again, all of this is centralised and people are forced to use the system. And that looks like that, which again is fairly standard. Most of your collection management systems will look very, very similar in terms of a very boring diagram. But over the last 5 years particularly, we've had to push our vendor quite hard, and our budgets, to get more out of the system that doesn't come straight out of the box. This isn't as exciting as it sounds. Basically, a lot of our natural environment specimens are stored wet in alcohol. And for compliance and health and safety, we need to make sure that we track the amount of alcohol that's coming into the building, where it's going, and where it's going. And for preservation, we need to manage the amount of, record all the details about pH and what was added and all of those sorts of things. So that's a new process that we've had to build in. Rights management and licensing isn't a brand new thing, but centralising it completely in the way that we have was not something that the system did. Again, it was a change of process as well, not just technology, but it means that by centralising it completely, the information is available on the objects and the images, and is available for the people who need it inside, but also projected with the information as it goes out to the various places it goes. Exhibition management is the last big process that we've added into the system. Mainly because it was incredibly complex. It doesn't have to be, but that's the way our institution works. We did have a separate system for this, and it was a classic example of information was being added into one system, not being verified, not being checked, not being synchronised in the other one, and neither system's information being trusted. So again, we've pulled it into a single system and tried to make sure that people are forced to use it and believe in the data. Born digital collections and digitised collections is An interesting one, we don't have a separate digital asset management system for our collection-related digital assets. And this tends to be the thing that when we tell people, they just stare at us blankly. But we put a lot of effort into making sure that anything that's collection-related is managed in the system as well, and that includes digital assets. And it's even more important for our digital collection objects. We don't make a distinction between the format, therefore it goes into another system. If it's the collection, it's managed by the collection management system. Repatriation of koiwi tangata, human remains. These are generally tattooed heads, but occasionally full bodies that were part of the trade of curios or whatever as part of Cook's voyages and the sort of 50 years afterwards. And so we've got human remains of Māori scattered around the world, and one of the programs that we have as the National Museum is to make sure that we can work with other museums to find them, agree to repatriate them back to New Zealand. We then do documentation and research of these human remains, including 3D imaging and various other things, and all of that is in our system. It's so that we can try to then trace it back to either a tribe or a region that they originally came from and then actually repatriate them back. So again, it's a system that, you know, a collection management system wouldn't usually have to manage with, but it's what we've had to build in. And this is a really big one. The CDOC CRM, I should have put a link in here, but I didn't. This is something that we've actually built into the way that we catalogue. We don't catalogue for collection management anymore. We do that as well, but that's just a really basic thing. We catalogue for access. And we catalogue not just our collection objects, not just our collections, but also people, places, terms, subjects, and stories. And all of that is managed centrally, and the way that we build up a standard cataloguing is essentially building up stories and narratives at the same time. And what that has given us is a really simple way of publishing stories and knowledge online, because curators don't have to get permission to use a separate piece of CMS software or something along those lines. They don't have to learn anything new. They enter it in here, it automatically goes through once we tick that little box, and it becomes part of our collections online, and it's really simple, and it creates a lot of ownership back to the curators. And so it starts to look like this. And it doesn't. I mean, this is a ridiculous diagram again, but you kind of get the idea of that's a lot of stuff, and it starts to look pretty complex. So, I mean, this is where we've got to now. A lot of people think that we've overcomplicated it, but I think that to a degree it works for us. We've had to push our vendor hard, and we've pushed ourselves hard. But there are really, really basic reasons to do it. No more lost, duplicated, or out-of-sync data. There is a single central repository. Well, less lost or duplicated and out-of-sync data. No data silos, and that was a really big one again. No more people holding on to secret data stores of their own and then not being willing to share it. Creates transparency. If you're not doing something in the central system, it becomes really obvious. And all of that improves standards and processes because you're forced to do it. We are pretty hard on our staff with needing to use the system. Consistent collection management and information management, and again, the really important distinction is about collections, not about the type of object that it is. Blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, we know all of these things, but it's, you know, a single focus for data preservation, one system to support and sustain, one system to train and learn to use, and that's a really big one when we're publishing more and more. And then there are other reasons that people might think are not so great. We have full control of this system, of this platform. We manage it, and we manage the development resource. We manage the relationship with the vendor, and we have a budget. We work really closely with our collections team and other people who use the system, but we don't have to wait in line with a development resource in-house who's also dealing with marketing and exhibitions and all of that and wait for our term. We can do this ourselves. And it's also what we know how to do, which is a really basic thing and possibly not the best reason to continue to invest in a single system, but it's realistic. And an interesting argument that came up in the MCG discussion was that many decisions around technology were more political than technical. We've been accused of that in the past. I don't think it's true. But there is, of course, problems, and being an advocate for centralisation and standards is often seen as being a barrier. You know, if you want something done quickly, and we're going, yep, but let's think about the long term, sometimes people just simply try to bypass us. So that's something that we have to work with. Change is constant, and, you know, we are rapidly trying out new things in terms of audience engagement. And with a big CMS, we can't necessarily adapt as quickly as we would like. And it does mean that some workarounds, which were just for that project, can become semi-permanent. And an interesting thing about having developed a collection management system over time is that our staff have gotten very used to the fact that it changes and it improves all the time, and they always want more. And we don't have infinite resource, and sometimes the things that they want aren't particularly good ideas. And interestingly, the flip side is I've spoken to other people who don't have any budget to develop their systems. Their staff just assume that that's normal and that systems don't change. So it's a great problem to be in, but it's an interesting one to balance. But probably the biggest thing is this system has become a really, really core system for everything that we do in the museum. We've doubled our users, and it's become very visible, but our team has stayed exactly the same size. So support and the skills that are needed need to change. Okay, so we're 2012. There's lots of changes that talked about at all of these conferences all the time. Opening up more and encouraging reuse and more ways of publishing, so needing to align content creation. Access outside is becoming more and more important, but access inside, I think, is changing as well, and being more open with our data and trusting our staff more. New forms of publishing, linked data is becoming really important. New forms of collecting, changing perspectives on collection, and stories are more important than ever, which is all fantastic. But it does raise the question of, okay, so do we need to change our systems to be able to deal with these things at the same time? We've already built a fairly complex system. Are we going to keep complicating it? So these are 5 newish things that we're looking at in the next few years. We've just been through a big revisioning and a restructure that goes along with it, but one of the big things that we're going to be focusing on is collecting intangible heritage. We don't really know what that means. But it does mean that we're no longer collecting just static physical objects. We're also supposed to be collecting contemporary. We don't know what that means quite so much either. But it does. I'm fairly certain that most of this will happen in some form of digital collecting. So digital is going to be more and more important. It's going to be in a variety of formats, but it's going to be digital. We can deal with digital and we can deal with a variety of formats, so that's not such a big deal. We already have a few things in place that will help us. We have a conceptual description model in place for things that may have a physical manifestation now, but that isn't necessarily what we're collecting, particularly with contemporary artworks and installation works. We don't separate out our digital from our physical. Again, we use the same system. Rights management is going to become more and more important with intangible heritage, particularly around Indigenous rights. And we have a framework in place in this system for managing that. We can describe digital objects and we can manage them. And as I said, there's a lot going to be, I'm assuming and I'm hoping, a lot of similarity to born digital artworks. One thing we don't really have in place in our system now, and it's not really a technology thing, it's more of a what the hell are we doing, is future representation of these intangible objects. We don't quite know how we're going to reinterpret them or represent them in the future. Digital assets and preservation. I cut this slide down a lot and it's already too long because, as we know, this is a really big issue for us. But with everything that I've just said, digital is going to be more and more important. I hope there's no dams vendors in the room, but I don't believe that preservation is a big consideration for dams at this point. I do hear that it is changing, but preservation has to be one of our core things that we worry about. Digital collections, as I said, if it's a collection object, it needs to be managed by the collection system, not in a satellite system with all the marketing material. And in some cases, digitized collections will become, the digital items will become the collection object because the original object will no longer be playable. We have a whole lot of U-matic videos that we've recently digitized, and we have changed the status of the digitized item to be collection objects. And this, as I say, this is overly simplified, but we have basic dam functionality. We've built that in already. We've simplified as much. We've centralised as much as possible. We've tried to make sure that information exists at the right level, so we're not duplicating object information at an image level. I've seen people in separate systems start describing the object on the image file, and it means that the CMS doesn't get that cataloguing, and there's a complete disparate separation of the content. We've already got repositories from a fairly open general repository all the way through to a single access digital preservation repository, which is essentially our collection store. We've got these kinds of things in place. We've got the processes in place, including for preservation actions, where we can repurpose our conservation module or extend it. But there's a long, long way to go with digital preservation, and everybody knows that. And it's a fairly big deal to extend a system like a collection management system to do it, but there are models that exist, such as the OAIS. SIPs, AIPs, and DIPs are possible, and we can actually model them as they are. That's submission information packages, archival information packages, and dissemination information packages. It's essentially just a workflow. There are lots of tools that are missing, but they could kind of be plugged in. But workflows is a real problem, and that's the kind of thing that dams do offer over this at this stage. Stories are becoming more and more important, and we're pretty good at projecting stories out to people. We're not so good at collecting stories back from the users, the public, the world. So we've been doing it for a while. We do it so much now that we want more and more and more. And what we've built is very template driven. So again, there are things that exist in tools outside of our system that we could pull in, rather than just sending everything out and reformatting it and then changing the data outside. And we really need to focus a way to collect their stories, which brings us on to user-generated and contributed content, or co-created, or whatever you want to call it. There's a big variety of formats of interaction that's going to happen, but it's going to happen more and more, and we actually need to make sure that we can manage and preserve this because it's part of the collection and it's part of our role. We've had a number of examples in the past where external systems have been set up, for a 3-month project, and it's collected all these images with not much metadata, and then it's like, okay, well, you guys sort that out because we've finished that project. We need to stop doing that and actually make it part of the cycle that we have in place for publishing and preservation. And it doesn't have to be for high tech. I'd love to start seeing that. We had an in-gallery activity where we asked questions of school kids about an artwork, and they just scribbled an answer on a sticky and stuck it next to it. We didn't collect any of that information. That's really important for understanding how people interpret our collections and what they like and what they don't. That needs to be coming into somewhere where it can be maintained in the long term. We have a conceptual framework that will allow this kind of storytelling and more sort of interaction with people outside. We have rights management again, which is going to be really important, particularly since we don't know what the user expectation is. If the public are giving us images for a project, do they think it's part of the collection? Well, we don't know whether it's part of the collection because we haven't figured that out either. So again, it's not necessarily technology, it's more a process and an understanding of what it is that we're supposed to be doing, although we don't have a great way to ingest from the web or from various places at this stage. This brings me on to object use, and this is kind of a weird one, and it's pretty, I can certainly see an argument for doing this outside, but basically our objects and our collections are used in completely different ways to what they were before. We know that things go on exhibition and on loan and all of that, and we track that in our collection management system, and that's fantastic. And we can see that it's the same objects over and over again. But with all of our collections released online now, and with many images and people using them in different ways, why aren't we tracking that? Why aren't we tracking the most popular viewed objects and seeing all the views and seeing all the likes and actually pulling that back as use data into the collection management system and making it really visible and making it part of the history of the object? If something is blogged, why aren't we recording the URL for that and maybe a snapshot of the page or any of those kinds of things? And that's the kind of stuff where we've got some things happening at the satellite. I mean, analytics is great. Add this as our sharing tool on collections online. That's all fantastic stuff, but it's satellite. We kind of look at it monthly and maybe say, oh, that one was kind of cool. But it doesn't get stored and it doesn't get centralized and it doesn't get viewed alongside all of the other information that's there. There are reasons for some of the reasons for why that might not be, why things aren't being used as well, and that could be that we don't have open licenses, we don't have images. So getting that information in is a way of actually measuring the quality of the record and therefore the impact. So we need to pull it in, we need to pull it together. I haven't seen this on any vendor's roadmap, but I think this is the kind of thing we should be pushing for. So with all of that, should we continue pushing for a single system? Do we keep going down this path? Do we make our battleship even bigger? There are plenty of alternatives, and we all know that. Various people are using various things, and they will have been discussed here. These are all tend to be external systems, and we find that plugging in can work, but it's not always as simple as you think. And there's huge problems with a single system. We're not oblivious to them. There's blurring boundaries with traditional museum business and standard business. For example, we're a government entity, so we have to run an electronic document records management system, a really exciting system, to manage our and record our business decisions. The thing is, a lot of our business decisions are actually museum decisions, and a lot of that information is recorded in the collection management system. So there's a really greying there. The other thing is we've drawn a fine line, a very strong line in the sand that said collection-related digital information and assets have to go into the collection management system. But it wasn't that long ago that I found a 100 megabyte TIFF of a bowl of fries from the cafe in there, because we don't have a digital asset management system, and the closest thing we have is the collection management system, but it's blurry. So we don't really know where the museum starts and stops as distinctly as we did before. HR and finance and payroll, I've heard people talking about museum management systems and starting to pull some of the stuff in. I find that terrifying, but my grey line is probably quite different to somebody else's. And huge complex systems are difficult to maintain, there's no denying it. Lots of other work has gone into these specific systems that have got years of development behind them, so why wouldn't we use them? And there are plenty of places who use a multi-system approach linked with persistent identifiers and a discovery layer, and that sounds perfect. I don't think it's always that easy. Or there are other ways of putting it, all your eggs in one basket. Jack of all trades, a master of none, and a lot of people think that if you start adding in all these bits to a collection management system, then that's potentially what you're building. I'm starting to feel like that in my role more and more, because we're touching more areas of the museum all the time, and we're having to dabble in areas that we simply don't have mastery of. Swiss Army knife, the name of the presentation. Everything you need except for when you need a completely different tool. And so what do, you try and use the Swiss Army knife anyway. Or Mia Ridge introduced me to a saying I hadn't heard before: when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And interestingly, I was using that disparagingly, apologies to any marketers in the room, about our marketing department wanting to use Facebook for everything because it's what they knew. Potentially we're doing the same thing. But I do believe that these concepts that I've been talking about are going to become core museum activities. They're not something that's going to remain satellite and go away. They actually need to be part of our core processes. Siloed ownership, we all know, is not a great idea. And museums need to be talking about long-term and sustainability of information, and really watching the information that's coming in different forms and making sure that we're aligning it with everything that we need to and preserving it in the long term. And linked data is going to become more and more important. Why would we want to try and link our data internally with lots of compromises before having to link out externally? Wouldn't it be better to link internally first in a native form so that you can concentrate with the real power of linking out to other collections? That's going to be difficult enough. And some institutions simply don't have the resource to manage and integrate multiple systems. And I mean, we're a reasonably big institution, but we don't have the expertise to run all of these different systems. And the vendors, I'll talk about them again in a second. But as a sector, we need to be moving in the same direction, and we need standards and guidelines. This is an aside, and you can tell because it's in a different colour. I mentioned the vendors, and I mean, we often sort of say not very nice thing about vendors. Are they evil? I don't think they are. We actually need them. They have developed a lot of what we have done. There's problems with us paying for development and then the vendor reselling them. But that's actually really good in a lot of ways, because it means the sector benefits from everybody else's work. The vendors don't necessarily know everything we want, and the only way it happens is for the bigger players to actually bite the bullet and pay for it and help other people. Similarly, all of this applies to open source as well. I mean, I don't care what system it is you're talking about, whether a vendor is involved or not. We need to start looking at these processes and including them in our core collection management systems. Technology isn't always the problem. It's understanding its roles and its processes, and it's the museum itself changing. And we need to get some digital ownership back to the curators and not just have it at this glossy level where it's unattainable by curators and educators. It needs to be something that they can own and deliver really easily. But I have been wrong before. So I don't have the answer. I mean, I'm actually going to come to the end of this with no conclusion. Collection management systems can't do everything, but I want them to do a hell of a lot more. I'm going to say it again, these new processes are going to become core museum activities and they can't continue to be satellite. Efficiency and sustainability and preservation have to be key issues. All of the things about single points of access, they're really obvious. As a sector, we should be moving in the same direction. I honestly believe that. So, I lied. So is continuing to push for a single system a good idea or not? That's all I can say.
So, thank you, Adrian. For anyone who had just joined us, our third scheduled speaker, Daniel Pett, will be unable to be here today. That is unfortunate, but it has the fortunate corollary that we do now have more time to discuss a lot of the many topics that have surfaced over the last hour of presentations. If anybody has a question or two to begin with for Adrian while his presentation is still fresh, maybe we could take a moment or two for that and then open it up more widely. Marla.
I have kind of a smallish, pinkish question, but sort of in the middle of your presentation, you mentioned you're talking about curators owning data and curators inputting things and checking the box to have it go online. So what happens after they check the box with your data? Does it go through other people or does it just go straight up on your website?
We check the box.
Oh, okay.
And for the sake of the video, let me say,
sorry.
briefly restating questions up here so we capture it on the mics.
Marla was just saying that what happens after a curator checks a box for this really easy publishing that we've put in place. I probably missaid that, and it's actually the collections information team who check the box. Once that happens, it goes through to the web, and it becomes part of the overall framework. These stories, we've only got a few thousand of them, so basically they email us and say, I've done these ones, can you make sure they're good and that they're ready to go? We don't do editing, we don't do anything along those lines. It's up to the curator to decide whether they want to go through an editor or a writer. I say don't do it unless you really feel the need to, because there's a big level of the types of stories that we're talking. Some of them are just a paragraph and just highlighting a bunch of objects. I don't think that we need to send everything. I want to trust our curators more and more with their writing abilities.
Does anybody format it, or?
We do a really quick check to make sure the HTML formatting is going to work. We have copy from Word problems and paste and get lots of Microsoft. We strip that out, but we try to train them to do that themselves. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible, basically. We want to trust them, yeah.
I think my question kind of ties in with hers in that I was wondering, as far as what goes online and how it's formatted and how it's displayed and packaged for the web visitor, how are you and your department, is that your role or is that marketing, or how do you work with that team if at all to manage that?
One of the things I very briefly touched on, this is around the making sure that the formatting and the of the curator stories and that actually work on the website. One of the things that I very briefly touched on is that we have built a very strong framework, and in terms of publishing stories and object pages and all of that, it's very template driven, very template driven. And the more that we publish, the more restrictive those templates are getting. So there's some basic formatting in terms of bullets and bold and all of those kinds of things. All the other data is rich and is coming from other places, so it's built automatically. When they associate an object, that's part of the template. If they want to start inserting, we've had to modify templates all the time, but they're still quite restrictive. So we have a web team who have built those templates for us, and that but that's also where our bottleneck comes in, because they're doing lots of other work as well, and that's why again we try to build as much back at the layer that we can control frameworks and structures, but formatting is one of the things that we're hitting as a real barrier now.
One of the problems that we have regarding formatting is we do a lot of CSV exports and tab limited exports, and what tends to happen is the curators will copy and paste their label fields from Word into their label text field, which means that their formatting is readable and correct and everything for all the output. I'm getting a lot of nasty diacritics and character terms, which should actually remain there. I don't mind taking them out, just for readability's sake. Do you have any recommendations for getting around some of these, these problems? Because I don't want to have to spend 3 days reformatting everything every time I want to push stuff to the web.
Okay, so let me try and summarize that. You might want to jump in on that as well, possibly with the amount of data, the type of data that you're managing. But it was about retaining formatting, particularly from Word or other systems, in fields, and then, which might look great there, but then when you export them, they look terrible. When you export them in different forms like CSV. There's only a few number of fields in our system that actually take formatted content, and they tend to be for publishing. We do have that, and one of the things that we publish too is Digital New Zealand, where they harvest through ONIPMH and pull out our data, and these formatted fields go through to there and look terrible. So no, I don't have an answer.
Great, and at this point, let's open it out to any questions, anything specifically for Micah, Aaron, or Adrian, or any broader conceptual, philosophical, practical, political questions, comments of any sort. Lots of stuff has surfaced in this session.
I don't know if this is a question, but I have to say I'm jealous of sort of the institutional support that's coming with the project you guys are taking on. I'm curious, if you have any advice to maybe take on more broad thinking about how the collection works in terms of how the code is assembled. I don't know if that's sort of the question.
So the question was about, well, it seemed like there were two pieces to the question. One was institutional support and how you set the groundwork for that. And then the code?
In order to get to the point where you have maybe more flexibility about how, I mean, you guys are pushing out updates in a way that I'm not sure we can get. I work with it on that.
I mean, I've only been there for 4 months, so I'm not in a position to really talk about the history of the groundwork. I mean, this is, Seb's been there for a year now. So Seb Chan is the head of digital and emerging media at the Cooper-Hewitt. And until he died a couple months ago, Bill Marbridge was the director, and he'd been there for 2 years. And so this has been an ongoing process. We know that we need to change as the national, we want to be the National Design Museum. We need to reimagine what that is. We have to sort of broaden the scope of what's possible. Micah might be able to talk more about the history of the groundwork. In terms of the code, I mean, it's a necessity. I mean, if you're going to do stuff on the internet, that's the only way it works. The internet is not a set of known boundaries. It's full of people who are going to start poking at it, and you don't know when, and you don't know how many. And so just from a management perspective, you need to be able to react quickly. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I can add to that. I mean, when I first started at the Cooper-Hewitt about 2.5 years ago, and we had our 1,000 objects in eMuseum already online, one of the things that sort of struck me was that, I asked a lot of people about that, what sort of the plan for that was, and not a whole lot of people could really tell me, because it felt like, people were doing things that other museums were doing for the sake of doing it. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought that this was a chance for us to kind of create some kind of momentum, like I said in the talk, and start to kind of push the train out of the station and think about how we can kind of shift things culturally as an institution. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question either, but I think that the point here is that you have to kind of start small and do little things that give you big wins and can continually grow.
Yeah, I would repeat what Micah said about Lots of small, simple steps is a really good way forward. It acclimatizes people to the idea of what's possible. You don't get stuck sort of building these enormous releases that everyone invests, you know, their personalities and their careers into. Those projects will always exist. There will always be big projects, but there's all that stuff that you can do in between. And I mentioned that I used to work at Flickr, and you know, we lived and died by the perception of whether or not we were releasing code. Not even code, just like features, whether the site was living. So I would start that way.
In the back.
Yeah, for Adrian, so you were talking about sort of the boundaries of what determines your collections management system. And I think that many of us have varying places where those boundaries lie. And I was wondering how you determine what belongs in your CMS versus what is definitely out of scope.
Okay, so that was how we determine what the boundaries are for what goes into our CMS and what doesn't, because everybody does have different boundaries. If it's collection related, and I mean, that's kind of a definite but loose term, then it goes in. Basically, anything that refers to, when you start looking at images, exhibition installations are collection related. That's fantastic. They should go in. A bowl of fries isn't. But there are some emails about an acquisition. So that's a classic example of where our legal requirement is to put those into the EDRMS. So what we do is, instead saying, great, that means we don't have to worry about the preservation of the email itself. The records management team can do that, but we want the content. And make sure that you put the content into the system where it's appropriate to describe whatever it was, whether it's an artist conversation or something that says it was too expensive or whatever. So we try to find ways to work with that to get whatever we think is really important. But finance is an interesting one again, because we need to record core financial information about an acquisition all the way through, you know, how much it costs to transport it and how much the Etherphone was and all of that. But we don't store receipts or anything along those lines. That's where a finance system comes in. So it does become blurry. And I don't want to replicate a finance system.
Well, but for instance, you know, for a digital asset management system, certainly you have images that relate to your collection or relate to installations, but you also might have images of events or, you know, donor meetings or, you know, whatever. So that means that you're maintaining a digital asset management system for non-collection materials as well as? Potentially.
Yeah. And I see that exactly the same as the EDRMS. That's about purpose, not format. And that's where I see the distinction. So, yep, definitely. I don't want, I see those examples as a bowl of chips.
Can I just jump in? One of the things I would add is, you know, I mentioned that we've done a lot of work to make all the various pieces in our collection first-class objects. And what that means is we've started minting unique identifiers for all of them. And those aren't going away. Our pledge is for those to exist forever. Those will exist, you know, permissions aside, those will exist on the internet. And what that means is, you know, to go back to your question of like what goes where, it starts to provide you with the flexibility of putting things in lots of different places. And if you can key off of that ID, now that's a search issue, but broadly speaking, if you can key off the ID, then suddenly you start to get, you know, a way that you spread the burden on the various systems, and you can put the unimportant stuff somewhere casual. So,
and we do have that a little bit in our EDRMS. So when you enter an electronic record into the document management system, if it's related to an acquisition, then you put the acquisition identifier into that document as well. So there is a little bit of a link. I should, just one more thing on that topic. When I say collection related, I also mean artists and things like that as well. So it doesn't have to be an object. We do have photographs of artists that go into our collection management system. So that, again, it starts to get grey because we don't have photographs of staff that go into the collection management system. So it's still grey.
Yeah, sorry, disambiguating here. Yes, black shirt, please.
You all talked about, taking your question information and putting it online in one format or another, whether it's, using a vendor or you're kind of taking your own path out of TMS. What about things like in-gallery experiences like apps or wayfinding, or even things like the Google Art project where you would be doing export? Like you talked about OAI a little bit. Is that something that you all at Cooper-Hewitt also addressed? And you too, Adrian, is that something that is kind of built in, or is that something that is kind of further down the road?
It's one of the key reasons why we centralise, is so that we can deliver in as many forms as we can from a single place. So Google Art Project was not as automated as we would like, but it gave us a starting point of the images and the information. We could just do a couple of exports and then get it into the format that they wanted. Our collections online, we also did build a handcrafted site, because when we did it a few years ago, our vendors' web services were not the best. So similar sort of process, and we push everything out. But we really say that's only one of the places that we deliver content. So we want to make sure that we've got as many paths out as possible, and centralising everything really helps with that.
And is that all within your control then? I mean, as far as exporting, like I need this set of data, I'm going to package it, or is it okay?
It is, and again, that's one of the reasons of not trying to have too many dependencies on other departments in the institution, because they've got enough to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, we'll export things in whatever format you want. I mean, honestly, that's not, like, we have no bone in that fight. I mean, I've been joking that we're going to do an export format called Tombstone for objects, which will just be exactly what it sounds like. I mean, we can do whatever. It's a data structure by the time it's getting to the delivery stage. And this is why there are templating languages. And this is why, I wanted to call out the part where, for us, we've gotten to the stage where we've built the mechanics around the API, and we did the extra work so that the API responses and the public releases are just the same thing, and we'll go from there.
In terms of the dialogue between TMS and your data, how often is that refreshed, and what is the sort of dialogue between those two? And for instance, if TMS is being updated very regularly on the object, what is the rate of data dumping from TMS into your code? And what is there like workflows for that? If there's people requesting a date change, or what is that sort of dialogue between what you're doing versus what's happening on the CMS side?
So the question is, what's the relationship between updates in TMS and updates to the collection site? At the moment, it doesn't happen very often. We did it the other day, so for the first time, or the second time, depending on how you're counting. We're still working through all the mechanics. Ideally, there'll be a button that you press. The other thing that would be ideal, and I don't know if TMS does this, but if TMS had the equivalent of push notifications, if TMS could send out a message every time something got updated, then we would know how to deal with that. But at the moment, it's a single build script, and then we move it up to the database. Right now, it's done by hand, only because to get lost in that kind of, the mechanics of automating it is just premature right now, but it will be.
I can actually add one thing we're sort of excited to see happen in the future once we sort of have these automated updates, not only to the collection website, but to GitHub. Provides us this sort of revision history. What GitHub allows you to kind of keep track of everything that changes every time you push new code. So if you can imagine over the course of many years, you'll start to actually see sort of what the museum has been up to, in a way. So that's sort of another exciting kind of possibility with GitHub.
In the back.
I was going to say, it's important to understand that a lot of these collections management systems, they've been in place 10 to 12 years and under very different circumstances. So in a lot of cases, they've been managed by registrars, And if the museums were lucky, the registrars that had some technological ability or understanding to get behind and really work, like in the case with TMS, on the SQL and really become understanding. In some cases where that didn't occur, the data model of TMS was perverted to do other things and used incorrectly, and to overcome that is a tremendous difficult thing. I'm sure you can understand. So everybody's moving into this new phase where we've kind of hit a limit, you know. I don't want to put more of that stuff that we're going to use online in my collections management system, but I don't yet have the place for it to live here, and yet I don't have the staff to make sure that we're recording everything and putting it exactly where it's supposed to be and tracking it. So in some ways, the technology has made it far easier. The demand has ramped up tremendously, and yet it's not being met by the staffing with enough expertise to really be able to stay on top of it and make decisions for the next 10 years. So it's a period with a lot of promise and a lot of peril right now, depending on your institution. You're lucky if you have people like yourselves who know code and know databases, and you're lucky if you have a working relationship with the people who really have to understand all the uses of that data within the institution. It's a tricky balance.
I agree.
I'm actually not sure if I do totally agree. I mean, in the sense that, like, it seems to me the thread that I'm seeing here is really that we've taken an existing model and we've now pushed it absolutely as far as we possibly can. You know, and we can add staff, we can, you know, perfect the data model a little bit more, marginally more, but it doesn't feel like that core system of the collections management, whatever that is, like we're still thinking of it in sort of record-keeping terms. And I feel like there's efficiencies somewhere in there that we're not finding, partially because we're just trying to extend that existing model, where the only way to make it better is put more people on the problem, or, you know, something like that, versus saying, well, you know, what happens if we put, you know, whatever, this is a terrible example, but what if we're putting RFID tags on the artworks so that movement data is no longer a manual operation? You know, but then that gets tweeted out all the time. So your CMS is not a record-keeping system, but it's just sort of, well, it isn't anything. You know, you have data flowing in, you have data flowing out. I don't know, it's something, yeah. I'm not coming down on that, but it's like something about that makes me just feel like,
I feel the same way.
I'm never going to be in a position to add more staff on a data problem.
In some cases,
I just don't see that ever happening.
The collections management systems, if there was just a layer in important areas where you could say, here's the data as it goes in for search, indexing, all the rest of that, and here's where I need to display it. And that's where most people are going to build a content management system. If you build a content management system to store and to link to that unique identifier every time somebody says something different about that particular object, you've built a whole nother crazy thing that you have to maintain. So I agree, sort of, well, I've been in the habit of tricking this thing to do all sorts of things, but I'm running out of options. And there are a lot of, in some cases, it's a design thing. Some of these systems could go back and be redesigned so that in a few key areas, you wouldn't have that impasse. It's an impasse you've been dealing with for 10 years and still hasn't been fixed. All you'd have to do is just do this and allow someone to put in the data exactly as it needs to be to represent the reality of the object, yet give you the ability to display it. That seems to be the first cutoff that you always reach in these systems, which is, it works, but I have to go to great lengths, and I have to do stored procedures, and I have to export it as XML and do all this other stuff with it as a style sheet. It's a lot. Just, you know, in some cases, you could circumvent an awful lot of that need for tech help by just giving users, registrars, curators the ability to say, I filled in these 5 boxes, but here's how I really want to express this information.
I guess that's what I'm wondering is, sorry. Well, I guess that's what I'm wondering is that in many ways we're sort of saying, well, what if we went back and looked at the CMS again and sort of redesigned it? But I actually would almost want to look at it in a wider way and say, like, if collections management as a sort of practice didn't already exist, is this the boundary that we would put around it? Like, are these the things that we would put in there? Right. Like, would we have a single system that does the things that we're talking about here? And you know, I'm not sure if it is. I mean, probably in some cases, but I wonder actually.
I think just in response to
I was at a workshop about integrating data, and I thought your presentation about the Swiss Army knife, like, my question about the software is, if we're jam-packing all these functions into software, and are we expecting one piece of software to live now the software development lifecycle of 4 different products in one trajectory? And how can any company, how can a museum even, as myself, like, we run a small shop, and I don't have that expectation of vendors that software, all of a sudden you're gonna have to develop in 4 different directions simultaneously. And we definitely have frustrations, and there's definitely boxes around things. But I think we're all in the quagmire together. I don't think that, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We have users that, really depend on the record-keeping component of the collections management system. It's like fundamental to what we do. And then we also have great online collection projects and, data streams, and I'm just trying to figure out how we're supposed to develop a product all at once, all together. I mean, for the smaller shops, maybe that's more of a reality.
One of my great hopes has been some growing partnerships between these different types of vendors with one another, because so many of these shops, they're too small. They've got all of their resources in one basket. All their staff is devoted to dams or collection information systems. So seeing them start to talk to one another to create sort of these odd kind of modular systems has been kind of interesting. I don't know that I'm really at liberty to say who I'm thinking of in particular, but I have seen, like with TMS, since we've been beating on TMS today, their partnership with OCLC to develop tools that can help push things around, that kind of thing. So I do see some opening up from the vendors, and I would like to see more of that, because I absolutely agree with you that the vendors don't have the bandwidth to develop individual products for each group. The administrative staff, a database manager might be great at collection information, but they might know nothing about marketing. And so how do we get around just internal management without the ability to select who controls what section and what set of workflows?
Well, that's a bigger problem than just collections management. I mean, just listening to all of this, one of the things I wanted to stress was, I came on strong at the beginning saying, like, we're not building a platform. My point in saying that is that we're trying to move the separation of concerns around. We will have an API. The goal is, we want to talk to other people. We want other people to talk to our collection. That will just happen at a different layer. It will happen at an API that actually works. People can, your robots can talk to our robots. And really, that's just documentation. I've been around long enough to see every couple years somebody starts pounding the table saying we need a single unified standard for developers to talk to their robots and robots talk to their robots. And it's just not true. What you need is documentation. You need reasonable documentation that's written in English that humans, or rather that's written in human speak, that humans can understand. The other way to think about it is this is the same problem we have with spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are just an API for the rest of us. And you still have that same problem where you're like, what does this column mean? And if we just pledge to actually explain it to one another, we'll be fine. We can figure out how to make these systems work.
That would sound to me like a fine way to wrap up the actual formal duration of this session, now that we're exactly on 5 o'clock. Lots of conversations that can continue. There is a reception in the exhibitors hall from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock. I encourage you all to make it down there and see what's going on. And I would imagine that some more informal discussion might continue on here for those who wish. Thank you all. Thanks again to the speakers.